project is going to be a set of baby bloomers with ruffles on the back. There's a free pattern, and there's also options for a paid pattern in other sizes, and I've got the link right up here. So I'm going to assume that you've gotten your pattern already and that you are ready to sew. I've got my materials here, and you can see that I've got my front and back pattern, and I've got some strips of fabric that I've cut for the ruffles. The ruffle dimensions are on the first pattern page piece, so make sure you don't throw those away or miss them. But if you did, it is 1.5 inches wide by 30 inches long, and you need to cut 2 of those. Also notice that when you're cutting that the the bloomers need to be cut on the fold. So I've got my bloomer front here, and you can see I cut it on the fold, so then when I open it out, I've got the whole front. Now I realize that these look like they are huge. It's okay, we're going to be using elastic to gather these in, and the reason that they look so big to begin with is because we want room for diapers. I'm also going to need to mark the back bloomer for the ruffle placement so I know where to place those. And let me show you this tracing paper. This is what tracing paper looks like. It comes in a package that looks like this. You'll have assorted colors here. And I'm going to use red because that's going to show up better, I think, on this green fabric that I'm using. And to use it, usually only one side of the tracing paper has the transfer stuff on it. So I'm going to fold my paper this way, and I'm going to place it outside my fabric so that each side of my fabric is touching some of the transfer substance. And I'm going to put my pattern back on top, make sure I've lined it all up. You may even want to use a couple of pins. And this is a tracing wheel. I'm just going to use it to trace right along those lines. And you'll notice that I'm pressing really hard and I'm kind of going back and forth. That's to make sure that the line transfers all the way through the pattern. On the second line, and you can see how that marking has now been transferred when I use the tracing paper. You always want to check to make sure that you also got the markings on the back side as well, because sometimes, especially with thick fabric, it has trouble going through and you may need to mark it again. All right, so now that we've got those marked, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to sew rolled hem edges on our ruffles. So let me show you how to do that. To sew a narrow rolled hem with a regular sewing machine and my regular presser foot, I'm going to start by selecting a zigzag stitch, and I want that zigzag stitch length to be very short. I'm selecting a 1 millimeter length right now. I also don't want it to be very wide, so I'm going with 2.5 millimeters wide. I want to see my needle in the furthest position to the right and left. So there's the furthest position to the left, and I'm just going to hand crank while I hold my thread to see the furthest position to the right. And there it is. I want that needle to be set down just past the edge of my fabric here. So right on the very edge. And once I've got that set, I can just start to sew. And you'll see one edge of my stitching is staying on the fabric and the other edge of the stitching is going off over the edge, and that's creating this tiny little rolled hem. How to sew a rolled hem on a serger. I followed my serger's instruction manual to set it up to sew a rolled hem. Notice that I am only using the right needle. The left needle has been removed. Once I've got it set up, this is super easy. All I have to do is start sewing. And you can see how the machine is automatically turning the fabric under as I stitch. If I'd like to create more of an edge than this, if I want my stitches closer together, that's an adjustment I can make on my machine with the stitch length knob. And you can see how now that's a tight, close together stitching as opposed to the more open stitching that I started with. To turn a corner, I'm simply going to stitch 1 or 2 stitches past the edge. Make sure the needle's raised when I raise my presser foot, and I'll pull and then get the fabric right under there and put the presser foot back down and stitch again around the corner. And you can see how I went around the corner there. You can also see from this chain that's being formed that the rolled hem stitch is great to make these little thread chains if you want to use them for things like belt loops. Now that I've got the rolled hem sewn on my ruffles, the next thing to do is gather these ruffles to be the same width as the lines that we marked on the bloomer's back. To do that, I'm going to set my sewing machine to the longest stitch length it will do, which on my sewing machine is 5 millimeters, and then I'm just going to sew one line of stitching right down the middle of each of these ruffle strips. That's going to help me gather my ruffle to the same length as the bloomer line. Alright, now that I've got a basting stitch sewn on my strips, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the bobbin side of the thread, and I've left myself some longer tail ends, and then I'm just going to do that to distribute the ruffle onto the rest of the ruffle strip here. And as I do that, I'm going to make it the same length as this line on the bloomers that I need it to match. So I have the ruffles pinned now onto my bloomer's back, right along those lines that we marked. And now I'm going to stitch them in place, and I'm going to be sewing right along that same line where I did the basting stitches. However, I'm going to make sure to be using a regular stitch length this time, because that's what's going to hold these gathers in place. We're going to be pulling the basting threads out, and we need something else to hold it. Because this stitching is going to go from the edge of the ruffle to the bloomer fabric, and it's not going to be crossed by another seam, I'm going to make sure to back stitch as I begin and end sewing on each ruffle. Alright, now I've got my ruffles sewn on my bloomer back. I've gone ahead and pulled those basting stitches out, and we're going to be sewing the bloomer back to the bloomer front now. I'm going to show you how to do a French seam finish. This is a great way to have finished seams if you don't have a serger. So what we're going to do is, instead of putting the fabric right sides together like you normally would, we are going to put it wrong sides together, and we are going to sew the two side and the crotch seams, but we are only going to use half of the seam allowance to sew these. So I have a 1/2 inch seam allowance on this pattern. I'm actually only going to use 3/16 of an inch, that's a tiny bit less than a 1/4 inch, to sew this first pass. So I'm just going to line that up on my machine and then stitch that seam. Okay, so I've gone ahead and I have stitched the 2 bloomers pieces down the side seams and across the crotch seam using 3/16 seam allowance, which is just a teeny bit less than half of my seam allowance on this pattern. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the pattern wrong side out, and I am going to press these seams, and then I'm going to stitch them again, and this time I'm going to use the 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I am going to, when I stitch, that will end up enclosing those raw edges inside the seam that I've sewed. So first thing I need to do is press, and I'm just going to make sure that I've pressed that seam well. In fact, you may want to press this on the right side first and get those seam allowances pressed to one side, and then turn it wrong side out to press. Okay, and now I am going to stitch. Okay, so if you look at the wrong sides of my bloomers now, you can see that I've got a little seam stitched there, and there is a seam allowance to the inside, but there are no raw edges on that seam allowance. They're the folded edges from the first seam. When I turn this right side out, if you did this correctly, you'll see that you have just a seam here, and there won't be any raw edges of fabric sticking out there. In fact, if you look really closely, you might be able to see the edges of the fabric encased in this little tube that you've made with the seam. Like I said, this is a great finish if you don't have a serger and just want to finish your seams on a regular sewing machine. What we're going to do now is we're going to be pressing the top edge of the bloomers and the leg edges of the bloomers to form a casing for the elastic pieces that we will be inserting. So all around the top edge, I want to turn it down 1/4 inch, and I want to do the same thing on the leg casings. And then I'm just going to press it with the iron. One thing to keep in mind when you are pressing the waist casing is to press the 2 seam allowances in the same direction. That's going to help when you insert the elastic, so that the safety pin or the bodkin that you use to insert it doesn't get stuck on the seam allowance. So I'm pressing the seam allowance away from me, and when I get around to the other seam allowance, I will also press it away from me. I've got the casings pressed for the bloomers now. So I did the 1/4 inch, and then I pressed again 5/8 inch because I'm using 1/2 inch wide elastic, and I need that to go through the casing. I did the same thing for the bottom of the bloomers here around the leg casings. Now you may notice that it's really difficult to get the casings to lay perfectly flat around, especially this curved area at the bottom of the crotch. That's okay. If you end up with a pucker when you sew there, it's going to be okay, because you're going to be inserting this elastic that gathers those legs in, and when you do that, any little puckers or wrinkles that you happen to not be able to get rid of, those are going to not be seen anymore because of all the gathering. So all you want to do after you have pressed the casings is you want to sew right along the folded edge, and you want to leave about a 1.5 inch opening to thread your elastic through for the next step. So I'm just going to stick that in my machine, and I am going to stitch it out. So I've got the casings for the legs and the waist on these bloomers sewn, and what I am going to do now is I'm just going to get my waist elastic, I'll start with that one, and I'm going to insert a safety pin in it, and then I am going to find the opening that I left right here, and I'm going to insert the elastic. Now because I pressed all of my seams this direction on the waistline, I am going to insert my elastic in that same direction so that it doesn't get caught up on that seam as I pull it through. So I'm just using the safety pin, and I am pulling my elastic through. Now, a couple of tips. One, so that your safety pin, so that your elastic doesn't go all the way through the casing where you have to pull it back out. It's a good idea to take the end of it and pin it to the casing there at the opening. That'll prevent it from getting pulled all the way in. The other thing that this does is this makes sure that my elastic isn't twisted, so that when I come back out the other side, I can make sure that I don't have a twist and I can overlap those elastic pieces to sew them together. And now that I'm back to the opening, I have to move my pin so that I can get out of the opening. I'm going to pull my safety pin back out of the opening there, and I've got my 2 pieces of elastic. I've made sure that they are not twisted. I'm going to take my safety pin off, and I'm just going to be overlapping these 2 ends. Then also a zigzag stitch right along the elastic there, and that's going to secure them together. So let me go ahead and do that. And I'll pull out some extra elastic so I have room to get it under the needle. I've overlapped my elastic ends about 3/4 of an inch. And when sewing elastic, I like to back stitch as well. So you can see I've got my elastic overlapped and stitched together, and now I'm going to go ahead and pull on that waistband, and that will pull and distribute the elastic in. Then holding it flat like this, I'm going to go ahead and sew that opening closed. And there is my waist on my bloomers. I'm going to repeat the same process on the leg casings. So I've sewn the waist casings and the leg casings. I've inserted my elastic and I've sewn those closed. And if you just give it a few good pulls, that helps really distribute the elastic around that casing. So now I'm just going to turn my bloomers right side out, and you can see that here is the front side and here is the back, and they are adorably poofy with their little ruffles to accommodate a diaper, and also just because poofy on babies is cute.